The men beside the nail keg in the Redfield store had a phrase for it. They passed it around like tobacco, each one shaping it a little sharper before handing it on. "A palace for chickens," they said, "and a coffin for herself." Out on the claim, 12 miles north, a woman was nailing mismatched window frames to cottonwood posts, 3 feet out from her cabin wall, in a line that made no sense to anyone who passed on the road. The glass was wavy and green. Some panes still had painted station lettering on them, backward. The whole thing rattled in the wind like a crate of bottles. She scraped old putty from a sash, warmed it in a tin cup, and pressed it back into the joint without looking up. Alida Vangen had not chosen the quarter section. Tomas had filed on it in the spring of 1886, when the grass still looked like promise, and the railroad agent in Redfield swore the siding at Gannett would grow into a proper town within 2 years. Tomas had a way of hearing only the words that matched what he already wanted. The agent said, "opportunity." Tomas heard certainty. He signed his name on the filing and drove the wagon 12 miles north without asking Alida whether the soil looked right or the creek ran year-round. It did not. The creek was seasonal. The soil was heavy gumbo clay that broke plows and swallowed fence posts. The nearest timber worth cutting stood 6 miles east along a coulee bottom, and even that was cottonwood, soft, wet, and prone to rot before it seasoned. But Thomas built. He put up a cabin of green cottonwood logs, 16 by 20 feet, with a plank door he was proud of and a clay and hay chinking job he should not have been. He planted 12 acres of wheat. He bought supplies on credit from Amos Dreckel's store in Redfield enough flour, coffee, nails, lamp oil, stove blacking, and signed for $29 against the harvest. The harvest failed. Hail in July took 8 acres flat, and hot wind in August shriveled the rest to stalks not worth binding. By September of 1887, Thomas Vangen owed $29 he could not pay, owned a cabin that leaked from every wall, and had a wife who had stopped asking him questions because his answers had stopped meaning anything. He left on a Tuesday. He took the team, 1 rifle, and $38 Alida had sewn into a flour sack behind the stove, money she had earned selling eggs to the Gannett freight crews. He did not leave a note. He did not say where he was going. Alida woke to an empty barn, an empty stove shelf, and the sound of Neil's coughing in the loft. Niels was 7. He was not her son. He was her dead sister's boy, sent west from La Crosse after scarlet fever took his mother and his father proved unequal to grief, and a child at the same time. Niels had arrived in June with a cracked slate, a wool coat 2 sizes too large, and a way of pressing himself against the nearest wall whenever a voice rose above conversation. He did not ask where Thomas had gone. He watched Alida's face the way a dog watches a hand, and he did what she told him. She told him to feed the hens. There were 23 of them, mixed breeds, some Dominique, some Plymouth Rock, a few red birds of uncertain parentage. They laid enough to trade for salt and oats at Gannett, and they were the only livestock Thomas had not taken. The 2 milk goats were still tied behind the cabin because Thomas could not rope them into a wagon alone and had apparently decided they were not worth the trouble. Alida stood in the barn doorway that Tuesday morning and counted what remained. 23 hens, 2 goats, 6 bushels of oats, 2 sacks of cracked corn, 1 3/4 cords of cottonwood split but green, $11.60 in a tobacco tin under the floorboard, money Thomas had not found because Alida had learned not to keep everything in one place. No horse, no rifle, no husband. 12 miles from Redfield, 4 miles from the half-dead siding at Gannett, and winter already sharpening its teeth on the northern horizon. The deputy came 3 weeks later. Roy Marden rode out from Redfield on a Thursday afternoon, his coat smelling of coal smoke and his horse blowing hard from the wind. He was not unkind. That made it worse. He sat at Alida's table and laid a blue legal paper flat between the coffee cups and explained that Thomas's disappearance had been judged abandonment by the county clerk. Under homesteading practice, a deserted wife could file in her own name. Alida knew this. Every woman on the prairie knew this, but only if she remained on the claim. Residence and improvement. 5 years total. If she left the quarter section before proving up, The filing would be treated as relinquished. Anyone could buy the claim for the filing fee. And Amos Dreckel, who already held Thomas's $29 debt, had made inquiries. Marden could not meet her eyes when he said it. You leave. They call it desertion of claim. Niels stood by the stove with his cracked slate pressed against his chest. Mrs. Cora Bell, who had driven over from her dugout 3 miles south to return a borrowed crock, sat in the wagon outside and watched through the open door. The wind caught the blue paper and snapped it against Alita's wrist. I'm not leaving, Alita said. Marden looked at the cabin walls, at the light coming through the chinking gaps, at the firewood stacked against the east side, not nearly enough, and both of them knew it. Ma'am, he said, I'm not telling you to go. I'm telling you what happens if you do. He left. Cora Bell climbed down from the wagon and came inside without being invited. She poured herself the last of the coffee and said nothing for a full minute. Then she said, How much wood have you got? 1 3/4 cord. Lord, I know. Abel Kersey arrived 2 days later. He was 61 years old, a former Army teamster who had driven supply wagons through Minnesota winters and now served as road overseer for the district. He was not Alita's friend. He was not her enemy. He was a man who believed that the prairie had rules and that people who did not follow those rules died, and that sentiment about it was a luxury the living could not afford. He walked the property in 12 minutes. He touched the west wall near the bedstead and held his palm there. He paced the firewood pile. 6 steps, a pause, a grunt that meant nothing good. He crouched beside the stove and put his hand near the door where the ash collected in a crescent on the floor, blown there by the wind that came through the wall itself. The frost is already inside the logs, he said. Alita said nothing. Kersey straightened. He was a tall man, bent at the shoulders from decades of handling rains and cold wind, and when he stood in the cabin he blocked the light from the one south window. A prairie winter needs 6 cords minimum, he said. 8 if the wind keeps north. You have less than 2 of green cottonwood that will burn fast and wet. You will need 1 full armload every 4 hours when the real cold comes. That gives you roughly 3 weeks of heat. Winter here lasts 4 months. I will burn slower, Alita said. The stove does not care what you intend. He told her to move into town, hire out as laundry help. Cora Bell could take the hens. The goats could be sold. Niels could board with the Presbyterian widow on 2nd Street who kept orphans for 50 cents a week. The claim would be lost, yes, but Alita would be alive in April. And my nephew, Alita asked. The boy will be placed. With strangers. With people who have firewood. Alita looked at Niels. He was pressed against the wall by the stove, one hand flat on the logs as if holding the cabin together. His eyes were on Kersey's boots. Mr. Kersey, Alita said, how many supply wagons did you drive through Minnesota winters? More than I can count. And how many of those wagons had someone else's child in the back? Kersey did not answer. He put on his hat and walked to the door. At the threshold, he turned and said, Mrs. Vangen, I have buried people who were more stubborn than you. They all thought they were smarter than the weather. He left. The cabin felt smaller after he was gone, not because of his size, but because of the space his verdict occupied. 6 cords minimum. She had less than 2. Every 4 hours, 1 armload. 3 weeks of heat in a 4-month winter. Alita sat on the bedstead and let the numbers press against her chest. She could not buy wood. $11.60 would not cover half a cord at Redfield prices. She could not cut it herself. The timber was 6 miles away, and she had no horse, no wagon, and no way to haul logs across open prairie. She could not borrow it. No neighbor had surplus, and charity on the plains was measured in cups, not cords, and she could not leave. The debt to Dreckel meant that leaving gave him the claim. Niels had no relatives willing to take him. La Crosse was 800 miles east, and even if Alita could reach it, she had no home there. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. Her sister was dead. The cabin on the quarter section, leaking and drafty and insufficient, was the only thing in the world she could call her own. If she held it through winter, she had a chance. If she left, She had nothing. She sat there while the light shifted and Niels fed the hens and the wind pushed ash across the floor in small gray drifts. She sat there and thought about firewood and stoves and how much heat a person needs to survive a night at 20 degrees below zero, and whether there was any way to get it that did not involve burning something she did not have. And then she looked at the broken east window. It had cracked in September when a hailstone punched through the corner. Tomas had nailed a board over it, and since then the east wall had been dark. But the board had warped, and now a stripe of afternoon sun fell through the gap and landed on the floor near the stove. The floor was dark, packed earth blackened by years of soot and spilled coffee. Where the sun hit, the floor was warm. Not warm enough to matter, but warm. Alida had grown up in Wisconsin, near La Crosse, and her father, Peter Brecka, had spent 15 years repairing greenhouses for a commercial nursery along the river bluffs. She had not thought about her father's work in years. She had not needed to. But now, sitting on a bedstead in a cabin that could not keep her alive, she remembered something he had shown her when she was 9. He had taken her into the greenhouse on a January afternoon. Snow was piled against the glass outside. The air was cold enough that her breath made shapes. But inside, the greenhouse was warm. Not heated. The coal stove at the far end was shut. Warm because the sun came through the glass and hit the stone floor, and the stone gave the heat back. Her father pressed her palm against the inside of the glass wall. It was warm. Not hot, not summer, but warm where outside was freezing. He held a cracked pane over a flat black stone and told her to wait. She waited. In 2 minutes she could feel the heat rising from the stone, trapped between the glass and the ground. Winter sun is not warmth, her father had said. Not until it is trapped. Alida pulled the board off the east window. The idea did not arrive complete. It arrived as a question. The kind of question that sounds foolish when spoken aloud and brilliant only after it has been answered. If glass trapped heat in a greenhouse, could glass trap heat around a cabin? Not as a window, as a wall. A second wall standing off from the first with air between them. Air that the sun would heat and the glass would hold, and the wind could not steal. She knew how greenhouses worked. Her father had taught her without meaning to, in the way that children absorb knowledge through proximity and repetition. She knew that glass let sunlight pass but stopped the warm air from escaping. She knew that dark surfaces absorbed heat and light surfaces reflected it. She knew that still air was warmer than moving air, and that the worst enemy of warmth was not cold, but wind. Wind that stripped heat from walls the way a river stripped soil from a bank. The cabin's problem was not that it lacked a stove. The stove worked. The problem was that every unit of heat the stove produced was stolen by the wind before it could warm the room. The logs were green and had shrunk as they dried, opening gaps in the chinking. The west wall faced the prevailing wind and leaked so badly that ash blew sideways from the stove door. Burning more wood would help, but only the way bailing helps a boat with a hole in it. You could bail forever, or you could fix the hole. What if the hole was not inside the wall, but outside it? What if the wind never reached the logs at all? She thought about it for 3 days. She drew diagrams in the dirt floor with a nail. She held her hand in the sunstripe from the broken east window and felt the warmth build on the dark, packed earth. She went outside and stood with her back to the south wall at noon and felt the sun on her face and the wind on her neck, and understood that both were constant, and that the only question was which one she could capture and which one she could block. On the 4th day, she walked to Gannett. The sighting was 4 miles east, a cluster of 3 buildings beside the tracks, a waiting room, a freight shed, and a section house for railroad maintenance crews. A spring storm had twisted the waiting room roof in May, and the railroad had abandoned the structure rather than repair it. Traffic had shifted to Redfield. The agent, Malin Voss, was a patient man who stayed because his wife liked the quiet, and because the railroad still paid him to flag the eastbound freight twice a week. Alida found him sweeping the platform of a building no one used. She asked about the waiting room. He said the railroad had written it off. The glass was still in the sash, 48 panes, mostly 10 by 14 inches, seated in 12 wooden frames. Some were cracked, some were bubbled. 2 still had painted station lettering on them. But glass was glass, and sash was sash, and Alida needed both. $3 and 2 dozen eggs, Voss said, if you haul them yourself. I will haul them. He looked at her, a thin woman in a mended coat, no horse, no wagon, standing on a dead platform in October wind. He did not laugh. Malin Voss had watched enough homesteaders to know that the ones who survived were not always the ones who looked like they would. I will write you a receipt, he said, for the glass. The receipt would matter later, though neither of them knew it then. Alida hauled the sash on a hand sled she built from cottonwood scraps and a strip of harness leather. 2 frames per trip. 6 trips over 4 days, 4 miles each way. 32 miles of walking. Her boots split at the sole on the 3rd trip, and she wrapped them with burlap and wire. Her shoulders ached in a way that settled into the bones and stayed. Niels pulled the smaller frames, the ones with only 2 panes each, and he did not complain because he did not understand that complaining was something he was allowed to do. By mid-October, she had all 12 frames stacked against the south wall of the cabin, protected by a canvas tarp she had traded Cora Bell a setting hen to borrow. The glass caught the afternoon light and threw broken rainbows across the sod. From the road, it looked like she was collecting windows the way some people collected cats, without plan, without reason, and without any chance of a useful outcome. Cora Bell was the first to ask. Cora was 40, widowed, raising 3 sons in a sod dugout that smelled of damp earth and boiled turnips. She was not unkind, but she was practical in the way that women who have buried husbands on the prairie become practical, without patience for ideas that cannot be eaten or burned. Alida, she said, standing beside the stacked sash. What are you doing? Building a glass walk. A what? Alida explained. A lean-to structure along the south wall turning the corner along the east, 3 feet out from the cabin logs, 7 feet high at the cabin eave, 4 feet 8 inches at the outer rail, glass and salvaged sash, angled to catch the low winter sun, a packed earth floor, straw bedding, hinged vents at the top. The cabin logs would sit inside a pocket of air that the sun would heat and the glass would trap. Cora listened. Her face did not change, which was worse than arguing. Glass breaks, Cora said. I know. Chickens stink. I will keep the bedding dry. Wind goes through everything. Not through glass. Wind goes through glass, Alida. It goes through it in pieces. Alida did not argue further. She knew the risks. The glass could shatter in a gust. The hens could foul the air until the logs rotted. The vents might not be enough to keep moisture from destroying the wood. Every one of Cora's objections was legitimate. Every one of them was a way this plan could kill her. But every one of Kersey's numbers was also legitimate, and those numbers said she would freeze anyway. The choice was not between safety and risk. It was between certain failure and uncertain chance. If the glass breaks, I will board the gaps, Alida said. If the chickens make too much damp, I will vent the air. If it does not work at all, I will have lost $3 in blistered hands. I would lose more than that sitting in this cabin waiting for wood I cannot buy. Cora looked at the cabin, at the chinking gaps visible even from outside, at the firewood pile that any farm wife could measure at a glance and find short. I paid for half your nails last week, Cora said. Do not make me regret pity. She climbed into her wagon and drove south without looking back. Amos Dreckel heard about the glass before Alida had set a single pane. Dreckel was 48, square-built, with a store in Redfield that served as bank, post office, and social court for every homesteader within 15 miles. He made money when people succeeded. They bought supplies. He made more money when they failed. He bought their relinquishments cheap, purchased their livestock at distress prices, and absorbed their debts into land he could resell when the railroad brought new settlers. Alida's failure was worth more to him than her success. Her claim was a good quarter section despite the gumbo, and Tomas's $29 debt meant Dreckel already had a lien on it. He did not come out to the claim. He did not need to. He simply talked, and on the prairie, talk traveled faster than weather. She's building a palace for chickens and a coffin for herself. The phrase was perfect, short enough to repeat, cruel enough to remember, and just plausible enough to make everyone who heard it feel wise for agreeing. Within a week, half the homesteaders between Redfield and Gannett had heard it. Children threw snowballs at the stacked sash when they passed on the road. A freight driver named Sims refused to haul the frames unless Alida paid cash in advance. $2 she could not spare. The store confrontation came in late October. Alida walked to Redfield to buy 8 pounds of cut nails. She needed them for the bracing and the sill plates. Without nails, the sash frames had nothing to hold them to the supports. And without supports, the glass was just expensive kindling. Drekel stood behind the counter with the nail keg between them. He did not refuse the sale outright. That was not how Drekel worked. He made the purchase feel like a verdict. "Glass is for town windows, Mrs. Vangen," he said, "not for prairie wind. I would like 8 pounds of cut nails. On credit? I will pay with eggs by spring. Frozen hens do not lay." 3 men sat by the stove. None of them looked at Alida. None of them looked away. The silence had weight. 8 pounds, Alida said again. Drekel weighed out 4. "This is what your credit is worth, Mrs. Vangen. Come spring, if you are still here, we can discuss the rest." She left with half the nails she needed. Outside, Cora Bell was loading flour into her wagon. She had heard everything through the open door. Without a word, she walked inside and bought 4 pounds of cut nails and brought them to Alida in the street. "This is a loan," Cora said, "not a gift. I understand. And if your glass house falls down, you still owe me for nails." "I understand." Cora handed her the paper sack. It weighed 4 pounds, and 4 pounds of nails was enough to start. Not enough to finish, but enough to start. Alida began building on October 16th. She had no plan drawn on paper because she had no paper. The design lived in the dirt floor of the cabin, scratched with a nail, and revised each night by lamplight. South wall first, 20 feet of glass walk, 12 sash frames braced at 4 points each, with cottonwood posts sunk 2 feet into the ground and cross-braced with scrap lumber. The sills sat on flat stones Niels carried from the creek bed, 3 inches off the ground to keep the wood from wicking moisture. The first post went in crooked. She pulled it out and reset it. The second post went in straight, but the soil was so hard she had to soak it overnight with water from the well before she could dig deep enough. By the end of the first day, she had 2 posts standing and nothing else, and her hands were bleeding at the knuckles where the shovel handle had worn through her work gloves. Niels held the posts while she packed the soil. He was 7 years old and weighed less than the posts themselves, but he leaned against them with everything he had, and the posts did not move. On the second day, she began setting the sill, a cottonwood beam she had split with a wedge and mallet, flat side up. The beam was not straight. She shimmed it with wood chips until it sat level enough to hold a sash frame without rocking. Level mattered because rocking cracked glass, and cracked glass let in wind, and wind was the enemy she was trying to stop. By October 20th, she had the south sill set and the west chinking repaired with fresh clay and rags. The cabin wall looked like a quilt made by someone who was angry, but the wind had stopped blowing ash across the floor. Then the weather turned. The first frost came on October 22nd, hard enough to kill the last of the prairie grass and turn the ground to iron. Digging post holes went from difficult to nearly impossible. Alida heated water on the stove and poured it into the holes to soften the soil, but each hole took an hour, and she needed 14 more posts for the south and east walls. She was 3 posts into the south run when she saw a man standing at the fence line, watching her. He was tall and stooped, wearing a canvas coat patched at both elbows, and a hat that had been rained on more times than it had been brushed. He carried a carpenter's brace square in one hand and nothing else. He watched her try to lift a sash frame onto the sill by herself, a task that required 3 hands and a level surface, and someone who knew what they were doing, none of which she had. The frame slipped. The bottom rail caught the edge of the sill, and one pane cracked with a sound like a branch snapping. Alida set the frame down and looked at the broken glass and did not cry, because crying took energy she was using for other things. The man walked over. He did not introduce himself. He crouched beside the frame and ran one finger along the crack. Then he looked at the sill and at the posts and at the angle of the glass relative to the cabin wall. "Why 3 feet out?" he asked. Alida looked at him. "Why not flush against the logs?" he said. "Because still air is warmer than nailed glass," Alida said. The man's name was Tolef Asen. He was 56 years old, born in Norway, trained as a carpenter in Minnesota, and for the past 11 years he had worked for the railroad building and repairing bridges, snow sheds, depot porches, and storm vestibules across the northern plains. He had come to Spink County to winter with a cousin who had since moved to Oregon, leaving Tolef in a rented room above the livery stable in Redfield with a cough he could not shake and no particular reason to stay. He had heard about the glass. Everyone had heard about the glass. But where Dreckel heard foolishness and Kersey heard stubbornness, Tolef heard something that made him walk 4 miles in a cold wind to see for himself. He did not offer to help. Not that first day. He picked up the cracked pane, examined it, and set it aside. Then he looked at the frame Alida had tried to mount and said, "Your sill is too narrow. The frame needs a lip to rest on, or the first gust will push it off. I do not have enough lumber for a wider sill." "You have enough if you split it differently. Let me show you." He took the next cottonwood piece she had ready and split it with her wedge, but along the grain instead of against it, producing a thinner, wider board. He laid it on top of the existing sill to create a 2-inch lip. Then he set the sash frame against it. The frame sat. It did not rock. "That is the first lesson," he said. "The wood tells you where it wants to break. You listen or you fight it. Fighting it uses nails you do not have." He stayed until dark. He did not say he would come back. But the next morning, when Alida came out to start work, Tolef was already there, sitting on the sill plate with a tin cup of cold coffee, waiting. Have you ever been doubted by someone who could not see what you were building? Tell us in the comments. And stay with us, because this glass walk is far from finished. The first thing Tolef taught her was triangular bracing. He set 2 scrapboards into a rectangle and pushed. The rectangle twisted and collapsed. Then he nailed a diagonal brace from corner to corner and made Niels push. Niels pushed with both hands. The frame held. "Every sash needs this," Tolef said. "Every single one. The glass does not break from cold. It breaks from flex. The frame moves, the putty cracks, and the pane walks out of the rabbet and falls. A triangle does not flex. A rectangle always does." He showed her how to cut the brace at 45 degrees with a handsaw. He showed her how to toenail it in place with 2 nails instead of 3, because 3 nails in green cottonwood would split the grain. He showed her how to test each frame by pushing it sideways with his hip before mounting it on the sill. The second lesson was putty and bedding. The old linseed putty from the gannet sash was hard and cracked. Tolef warmed it in a tin cup near the stove until it softened, then worked it with his thumbs into a rope and pressed it into the rabbet around each pane. He did not smear it. He pressed it in one continuous bead, sealing glass to wood without trapping air bubbles underneath. "Cold putty cracks," he said. "Warm putty seals. You do this in the morning after the stove has been running, not in the afternoon when your hands are stiff." The third lesson was expansion. Glass and wood did not grow and shrink at the same rate. If a pane was pinched tight, glazing points driven hard against the glass, the first temperature swing would crack it. Tolef showed Alida how to leave a whisper of space, barely visible between the point and the glass. Just enough give for the pane to breathe without rattling. "You hear rattle? You fix it that day," Tolef said. "Rattle means the point has walked. A point that walks lets the pane walk. A pane that walks falls." By the end of the first week together, Alida understood something about Tolef that she had not expected. He was not helping her out of charity. He was not doing this because she was a woman alone or because he felt sorry for Niels. He was doing this because she had answered his question correctly. Still air is warmer than nailed glass was not something a desperate fool would say. It was something a person would say who understood the principle behind the work. Tolef had spent 30 years building structures that had to survive wind, ice, and the indifference of employers who did not care whether the work was beautiful as long as it stood. He recognized competence the way a carpenter recognizes straight-grain mat, by testing it, not by asking about it, but the weather was not waiting for lessons. October 28th, 12 feet of south glass standing, but the remaining 8 feet of sill was not set, and the east corner had not been framed. 4 panes cracked during the night when a gust flexed 2 frames that Alida had mounted before Tolef showed her the diagonal bracing. She spent a full day removing and rebracing them while the temperature dropped to 19 degrees and the sky turned the color of old lead. November came like a door closing. The daylight shrank, the shadows lengthened, and the glass walk was not half finished. Tolef came every morning. He walked 4 miles from Redfield in the dark, arrived before Alida had finished milking the goats, and worked until the light failed. He did not explain why. Alida did not ask. There are arrangements between people that survive precisely because no one puts words around them, and this was one. November 6th, the east corner was framed. 4 posts sunk, the corner brace set at a 45-degree angle, and 6 sash frames mounted along the east wall. But the cold had changed the work. Putty that Tolef warmed inside the cabin grew stiff before he could carry it 10 feet to the glass. His fingers cramped. Alida's cracked knuckles opened further, and the blood froze in thin lines on the wood before she could wipe it. 4 more panes cracked that week. 2 from flex, frames Alida had braced before Tolef's diagonal lesson, which she had to tear down and rebuild. 2 from a stone that Niels kicked while chasing a hen, a mishap so small and so costly that Alida stood looking at the broken glass for a full minute before she knelt and picked the pieces out of the frozen mud. 48 panes to start. 8 lost. 40 remaining, and the design needed everyone. Tolef said nothing about the broken glass. He said, "We fill the gaps with oiled cloth and board them when ice comes. Glass where it matters, cloth where it does not." He was teaching her triage. Not everything could be perfect. The south wall mattered most. It faced the winter sun. The east wall caught morning light but less of it, and the east corner took the worst wind. Glass on the south, glass and cloth on the east, board over any gap that could not hold a pane. November 11th, a warm day. The temperature climbed to 42 degrees, which should have been welcome and was instead a disaster. The clay chinking on the west wall, softened by the warmth, slumped and opened a seam behind the stove. Cold air poured through the gap, and the stove draft reversed, filling the cabin with smoke. Niels coughed until his eyes ran. Alida patched the seam with fresh clay, straw, and strips of flour sacking, but the repair took half a day she had planned to spend setting east wall frames. Every warm day was a thief. It stole time by breaking something that cold had been holding together. November 18th, 1 full wall enclosed. 20 feet of south-facing glass, 12 frames braced and puttied, standing 3 feet from the cabin logs with a packed earth floor between. Alida moved 6 hens inside during daylight as a test. They scratched in the straw. They clucked. They pressed against the cabin wall where the low sun had warmed the logs, and within an hour the air inside the glass walk was warmer than the air inside the cabin. Alida held her hand against the cabin's south wall from inside. Warm. Not hot, not summer, but warm. The logs absorbing heat from the sun-warmed air in the glass space and radiating it inward. For the first time since Thomas left, the cabin wall felt like something other than a barrier between her and death. She did not celebrate. She moved the hens back outside and kept working. Tolef watched her face when she felt the warm wall. He said, "Now you know it works in sun. You do not know if it works in wind. You do not know if it works at night. You do not know if it works at 30 below. I know. Good. Because Kersey will come back, and he will ask those questions, and you need answers that are not hope." November 22nd, a northwest gust hit at 2 in the morning. Alida woke to a sound like gunshots, glass breaking in rapid sequence. She lit the lamp and went outside in her coat and bare feet and found 6 panes shattered on the east wall. The wind had caught the corner where the south wall met the east, creating a vortex that flexed the frames sideways. Tollef's diagonal braces had held the frames in place, but the panes themselves had popped from the rabbets and fallen. 6 panes in one night. She had 34 left and could not afford to lose a single one. In the morning, Tollef examined the damage. He did not curse or comfort. He studied the corner joint, the angle of the break, and the direction of the putty failure. Then he said, "The corner needs a windpost, a vertical timber on the outside, not the inside, that breaks the gust before it wraps the building." They set it that day. A cottonwood post, 6 inches in diameter, sunk 2 feet into the frozen ground at the exact point where the south wall turned east. Tollef braced it to both walls with scrap lumber, creating a triangulated corner that could not flex. "This is what snow sheds taught me," Tollef said. "The wind does not push. It wraps. It finds corners and pulls. You do not fight the push. You break the wrap." The goats created their own crisis. They chewed through the straw bedding in the glass walk twice in 3 days, pulling strands through the bottom rail where the frames met the sill. Alida built a low fence from scrap lumber to keep them out, but the fence used nails she needed for the east wall frames. Every solution cost something else. Niels cut his thumb on the 3rd day of November, carrying a sash frame from the stack. The glass edge opened a gash from the nail to the first knuckle, deep enough that Alida could see the white of the bone before the blood covered it. She wrapped it with a strip of boiled cloth and told him to sit by the stove. He sat for 20 minutes, then came back outside and held posts with his other hand. He was 7. He did not know that what he was doing was remarkable. He only knew that Alida was working, and that not working felt worse than a cut thumb. Alida's own hands had passed the point of healing. The knuckles on both hands were split open, the skin cracked in lines that followed the joints like seams in old leather. She wrapped them in grease and rags each night, and unwrapped them each morning to find the rags stuck to the wounds. Tollef saw it and said nothing. He had seen worse hands on railroad crews, and he knew that saying something would not make the work lighter, only the silence heavier. But Tollef's own body was failing in ways he did not show. Twice in the last week of November, Alida saw him turn away from the work to cough into a rag. The second time, she saw the rag before he folded it. The stain was dark red, not the rust of a chest cold, but the bright wet red of something deeper. He caught her looking and put the rag in his pocket and picked up the brace square. "The east vents," he said. "We need to cut them before the top rail freezes." She did not ask about the blood. He did not offer to explain. The work continued because stopping it was not something either of them could afford. December 1st, the top vents were cut. 3 hinged openings along the high side of the south wall, each 1 foot by 8 inches, controlled by a peg and hole system that allowed Alida to open them from inside the glass walk without climbing. Tollef designed the hinge from leather straps, and the peg system from dowel rods whittled from a broken axe handle. The straw floor was laid 4 inches of clean oat straw over the packed earth, replaced weekly to keep the moisture down. And along the cabin's south wall, inside the glass space, Alida placed a course of blackened stone she and Niels had carried from the creek bed. Creek stones, dark with iron stain, each one the size of a bread loaf. 14 stones in a row against the logs, sitting in full sun from 10 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. The stones were Tollef's idea and Alida's father's principle. Dark mass absorbs heat. Heat stored in stone releases slowly. The stones would warm all day in the sun-heated glass space and give their heat back to the cabin wall through the night. "How much heat?" Alida asked. "Enough to notice," Tollef said. "Not enough to save you alone. The stove still matters. The glass still matters. The hens still matter. One trick does not win. All of them together might." Unexpected help arrived on December 4th. Warren Bell, Cora's oldest son, drove up in his mother's wagon with 2 storm shutters in the bed. They were heavy pine, built by his late father for the dugout, and never used because the dugout's window faced north. Warren was 24, quiet, built like a fence post, and embarrassed to be there. "Ma said these were doing no good in the loft," he said. Alida used them as night covers over the weakest east panes, the ones patched with oiled cloth where the broken glass had been. Each night she leaned the shutters against the east frames, blocking the wind but trapping whatever warmth the glass space still held. Each morning she removed them and let the sun in. It was not elegant, it was not permanent, but it was one more layer between the cabin and the cold, and on the prairie, survival was measured in layers. December 7th, Kersey returned. He came on horseback, his beard frosted, his coat buttoned to the throat. He had not been to Alida's claim since October, and the glass walk had not existed then. He stopped his horse at the fence line and sat there for a full minute, looking at the south wall of the cabin and the structure standing 3 feet in front of it, glinting in the winter sun like something between a greenhouse and a fever dream. He dismounted and walked closer. He did not speak. He walked the length of the south wall, paused at the corner post where the south met the east, and continued along the east frames. He looked at the straw floor through the glass. He looked at the hens scratching inside. He looked at the blackened stones along the cabin wall. "What is this?" he said. "A glass walk." "I can see that. What does it do?" Alida opened the door to the glass space. "Put your hand inside." Kersey hesitated. Then he stepped in. The glass walk was narrow, 3 feet from outer glass to cabin logs, and crowded with hens and straw and the smell of warm birds and earth. The sun was at its midday angle, pouring through the south panes and hitting the stones and the cabin wall. The air inside was noticeably warmer than outside. Kersey stood there for 10 minutes. He did not speak for the first 5. Then he held his bare hand against the cabin's south wall and felt the warmth bleeding through the logs from the heated airspace. "How warm does it get?" he asked. On a clear day at 8 degrees outside, the glass walk reaches the mid-50s by noon. The cabin reaches the low 40s with the stove damped down. Kersey withdrew his hand. He looked at the vents. He looked at the diagonal braces. He looked at the putty lines. "You are building the winter away into your house," he said. But his voice had changed. The certainty was gone. He was not telling her she was wrong. He was telling himself that she might not be, and that the difference between those two things was the distance between his experience and her experiment. He did not praise her. He put on his hat and rode back to Redfield. But he did not laugh, and on the Dakota prairie in December, a man who stopped laughing was halfway to believing. By December 12th, the glass shell was complete, 20 feet along the south wall, 14 feet along the east, 3 feet of airspace, 34 glass panes in 10 sash frames, braced with Tollef's diagonals, puttied with warmed linseed, shimmed with leather strips, and backed on the east side with oiled cloth and Warren Bell's storm shutters. The floor was packed earth covered with straw. 14 blackened creek stones sat in a row against the cabin's south wall. 23 hens moved freely through the space during daylight, their bodies adding a low, constant warmth that smelled of feathers and grain, and the particular sharp sweetness of healthy birds in clean bedding. From the road, it looked ridiculous. Mismatched panes shimmered green and wavy in the low sun. Some were clear, some were bubbled with age. 2 still showed the painted station lettering from Gannett, backward now, reading 10 in faded black. The frames did not match. The corner post looked like it had been driven in by someone who was angry at the ground. The whole structure rattled when the wind blew from the west, a sound like bottles in a crate, and the hens visible behind the glass gave it the appearance of a poultry exhibition designed by a lunatic. But Alida had 3 thermometers now. One hung outside under the north eave, exposed to the wind. One hung inside the glass walk at chest height. One sat on the cabin table near the stove. And on December 13th, when the outside thermometer read 8 degrees above zero and the sky was clear, the glass walk reached 56 degrees by noon. The cabin climbed from 26 to 41 with the stove damped low, barely burning, the firewood lasting 3 times as long as Kersey's calculation predicted. The glass walk was not a greenhouse. It was not heated. It was a trap, a pocket of still air that caught the sun's heat, held it against the cabin wall, and let the logs absorb it like a stone absorbs warmth from a fire. The principle was simple. The execution was ugly, and the result was measurable in ways that Kersey's math could not dismiss. But the warmth brought a new enemy: moisture. On December 15th, Alida noticed frost beating on the cabin logs inside the glass space. Not outside where frost was expected. Inside, where the warm, damp air from the hens and the straw and the heated earth met the cold surface of the logs. The frost was thin, a glaze, almost invisible, but Tolef saw it, and his face changed. "Open the vents," he said. "It is 14 degrees outside." "Open them. I will lose the heat. You will lose the wall." He made her open the top vents for 10 minutes. Warm air rushed out. Cold air dropped in. The hens pressed against the stones. The temperature in the glass walk fell 15 degrees in 10 minutes, and the frost on the logs began to dry. "Warm rot will kill a wall slower than frost kills a child," Tolef said. "But it still kills. You vent every day, morning and afternoon, 10 minutes each time, even when it hurts." He was right, and Alida knew it. Trapped moisture would rot the logs from the outside in, turning her windbreak into a sponge that would collapse under its own weight by spring. The vents were not a luxury. They were the price of the design. The innovation was not magic. It was a trade: warmth for vigilance, comfort for discipline. Every benefit came with a condition, and every condition required daily attention from a woman who was already doing the work of 3 people. Skeptics found new ammunition. Cora Bell came by and said the warmth worked only because the weather had been mild. No real storms yet, just the ordinary cold of early December. "Wait until a whiteout," she said. Kersey, who had stopped laughing but had not started believing, said the first real wind would take the roof off the glass walk and leave Alida worse than before. Holes in the wall where the braces were nailed, broken glass mixed with straw, and hens scattered across the prairie. Dreckel did not come himself, but he sent word through a customer that he would pay $2 for the glass after it broke. He said after, not if. Alida recorded the temperatures each day in pencil on the back of the receipt Malin Voss had written for the glass. She wrote the date, the outside temperature, the glass walk temperature, and the cabin temperature. She did this because Tolef told her to. "Numbers are the only argument that outlasts opinion," he said. "When they come to tell you it does not work, you show them the numbers and let the numbers talk." The shells stood. The temperatures held. December passed in a rhythm of morning venting, noon warmth, afternoon feeding, and evening cold. Alida burned less wood than she had expected. The firewood pile shrank, but slowly, 1 armload every 6 hours instead of every 4. The stove ran lower, the cabin stayed warmer. The hens laid, not as many as summer, but enough 3 or 4 eggs a day from 23 birds, because the birds were dry and fed and sheltered from wind that would have killed them in an open coop. But every morning Alida looked north, and every morning she knew that the real test had not come. December had been cold. December had not been deadly. The kind of cold that killed people and livestock and entire communities had not yet arrived, and when it came, it would not announce itself. It would come fast, and it would come from nowhere, and everything she had built would either hold or it would not, and the difference would be measured in lives. January of 1888 began wrong. The 12th of January was warm. Not cool, not mild. Warm. The temperature climbed to nearly 40 degrees by mid-morning, and the snow that had crusted the prairie for weeks began to soften and slide. Water ran from the glass walk roof in thin streams. The hens emerged from the straw and stood blinking in sunlight that felt like March. Alida opened every vent. The glass walk hit 80 degrees before noon, so warm that the hens panted and the straw smelled of summer. It was the kind of day that made people careless. Niels asked if he could go to Cora Bell's dugout. Warren had promised to let him help haul water from the creek, and Niels had been inside for weeks. Alida said yes. She watched him walk south across the softening snow, his coat unbuttoned, his cracked slate tucked under one arm because he never went anywhere without it. He waved once and disappeared over the low rise between the 2 properties. Tolif arrived late that morning, walking slower than usual. His cough had worsened through December, a deep wet sound that came from somewhere below the ribs. He sat on the bench inside the glass walk and watched the thermometer climb, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Close everything if the wind shifts south by east." "Why?" "Because warm air from the south in January is a lid. When the lid comes off, the cold falls in all at once." Alida looked at the sky. It was hazy. The sun had a ring around it, the kind of pale circle that her father used to call a weather eye. The air smelled wet and heavy, like a blanket left too long by a fire. "How fast?" she asked. "I have seen 40 degrees to 10 below in 4 hours, Tolif said. "On the railroad, we lost a man in Minnesota because he walked a quarter-mile from the depot without his coat. The temperature was 50 when he left. It was 8 below when they found him." Alida closed the vents. She latched the glass walk door. She fed the stove 2 large pieces of cottonwood, the kind she had been rationing, and filled the water pails from the well while the pump still worked. The first sign came at 1 in the afternoon. It was not snow. It was silence. The wind, which had been blowing softly from the south all morning, stopped. The rail whistle that Alida could hear from the Gannett siding on still days, a thin sound, more vibration than noise, vanished mid-note. The hens stopped clucking. Even the goats, who were never quiet, stood motionless in the shed with their ears forward. Then the sky turned gray. Not cloud gray, metal gray, the kind of gray that has weight and texture, and no light behind it. And the temperature began to fall. Alida felt it in her face first, a tightness in the skin, as if the air were pressing inward. She went to the outside thermometer, 38 degrees. She went inside, came back 5 minutes later. 31. 5 minutes more. 24. 7 degrees in 10 minutes. The snow came next, but it was not falling snow. It was horizontal. The wind arrived from the northwest like something with weight and intention, and it drove the snow sideways so hard that Alida could not see the goat shed from the cabin door, a distance of 40 feet. The world disappeared. 1 minute she could see the fence line, the road, the faint smudge of Cora's chimney smoke to the south. The next minute she could see nothing but white, and the white was moving, and the sound was a roar like a train that never passed. Niels was at Cora's. The thought hit Alida like a physical blow. 3 miles south across open prairie, in a whiteout, with a 7-year-old boy who weighed 60 pounds and had never seen weather that could kill a grown man in 15 minutes. She could not go. Every instinct she had told her to stay inside the only warm structure between here and Redfield. The glass walk was holding. The cabin was warm. The hens were alive. If she went out, she might die in the snow. And then Niels would be an orphan twice over, and the cabin and the claim and everything she had built would mean nothing. But Niels was out there. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us. Because what happens next is the moment everything Alida built either holds or breaks, and it is not just glass that is being tested. Alida tied a rope to the porch post, 50 feet of hemp line, the same rope she used to tether the goats. She tied the other end around her waist and walked to the goat shed. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The wind hit her so hard she staggered sideways and caught herself on the shed wall. Inside, the goats were pressed against each other, their eyes wide, their breath making clouds that the wind tore away. She tied a second rope from the goat shed to the fence post at the south end of her property. That gave her 120 feet of guideline from the cabin to the edge of her land. Beyond that, there was nothing but open prairie and 3 miles of white air between her and Cora's dugout. She almost turned back. The cold was not just cold now. It was a force, a presence that pushed against her chest and pulled the warmth from her body through every seam and gap in her clothing. Her face burned. Her fingers, wrapped in double mittens, were already numb at the tips. Then she saw the boy. Not Niels. Cora's youngest, a child of 5, running through the white air without a coat, his arms pumping, his mouth open in a scream the wind swallowed whole. He came out of the snow like a ghost and hit the fence line and grabbed it with both hands and held on. Alida caught him. She wrapped her coat around him and carried him to the glass walk and set him on the straw beside the stones. He was shaking so hard his teeth sounded like someone tapping a nail. She could not understand what he was saying. Then she could. Mama fell down. Niels fell down. They are on the ground. Alida closed the glass walk door. She looked at Tolef, who was sitting on the bench inside, his coat pulled tight, his face gray as the sky. He had not moved since the wind hit. He looked at her and said, "Take the rope, all of it. Tie the pieces together." She knotted 3 lengths of rope into one, nearly 200 feet, enough to reach past the fence line and into the open prairie between her property and Cora's. She tied one end to the porch post and walked into the wind. The glass shell began to boom. That was the sound. Not breaking, not cracking, but booming. The wind hit the south glass wall, and the panes flexed inward, held by Tolef's braces, and the air pocket between the glass and the cabin wall compressed and released with each gust, producing a deep, hollow sound like a drum struck with a fist. The east panes cracked, 6 of them, splintering along the bottom edge where the wind wrapped the corner. But the corner post held. The diagonal braces held. The frames stayed in their sills, and the broken panes remained in their rabbets, fractured but not fallen. Inside the glass walk, the hens crowded against the cabin wall. 23 birds pressed together in a mass of feathers and warmth, their combined body heat radiating into the logs. The thermometer in the glass walk read 29 degrees. Outside, the temperature had fallen below 0 and was still dropping. Alida walked south into the storm. She paid out rope behind her, hand over hand, and she counted her steps because counting was the only way to know how far she had gone when she could not see anything but white. 100 steps. 200. The rope went taut. She had reached the end. She stood in the whiteout at the end of 200 feet of rope and screamed Niels's name into the wind. The wind took the sound and shredded it. She screamed again. A hand found her ankle. Cora Bell was on the ground. She had been crawling. Her shawl was frozen stiff around her head, and her face was the color of tallow. Behind her, holding onto Cora's skirt with one hand, was Niels. His right mitten was gone. His bare hand was white. Alida pulled them up. She put Niels between her body and Cora's and said, "Hold the rope. Do not let go. Walk." They walked. Or they stumbled, or they crawled. The distinction did not matter. The rope mattered. Hand over hand, step by step, following the line through white air that had no up or down, no near or far, only the wind and the cold and the rope. They reached the fence line, then the goat shed, then the porch. Alida pulled them into the glass walk and closed the door, and the sound of the wind dropped from a roar to a moan, and the warmth hit their faces like a wall. The glass walk was holding. Not perfectly. 6 east panes were cracked. Wind whistled through the fractures in thin threads. The straw nearest the east wall was dusted with fine snow that had sifted through the breaks. But the south wall was intact, and the airspace between the glass and the cabin was still warm, and the hens were still alive, and the thermometer read 26 degrees. Alida brought Niels to the stones first. Not the cabin, the stones. The blackened creek rocks along the cabin wall had been absorbing sun all morning during the warm hours, and they still held heat. She pressed Niels's frozen hand against the warmest stone and held it there. The stone was not hot. It was the temperature of skin on a mild day, blood warm, no more. But against a hand that had been freezing, it was enough. His mitten was gone. His fingers were white and stiff. Alida wrapped them in dry straw, and then in a wool scarf, and then in her own hands, and she sat on the floor of the glass walk with a 7-year-old boy in her lap and a frozen woman beside her, and the wind trying to dismantle everything she had built, and she waited. Cora's youngest sat against the cabin wall with a hen in his lap. He had stopped shaking. His eyes were closed. The hen did not move. Tolef checked the braces. He went out into the glass walk with the wind booming against the panes and inspected each frame, each diagonal, each sill connection. He came back and said, "The east will lose more glass, the south will hold." "How long?" Alida asked. "As long as it needs to." The night was the worst. The temperature outside fell past 20 below, past 25. At some point after midnight, Alida checked the outside thermometer by lamplight, and the mercury read 30 below zero and was still dropping. The wind had not stopped. It had not even paused. It drove snow against the glass walk in waves, each gust depositing a layer of white that slid down the panes and collected in drifts against the sill. Inside the glass walk, the temperature held at 19 degrees. Cold. Not warm, but 19 degrees above zero was 49 degrees warmer than the air outside, and the difference was the difference between survival and death. Inside the cabin, with the stove running low, Alida was still rationing wood. Even now, the temperature held at 35, cold enough to see breath, cold enough that the water in the wash basin had a skin of ice by morning, but warm enough to live, warm enough that Niels's fingers, wrapped and held and slowly, painfully returning to color, would not be lost. The north side of the cabin told the rest of the story. The lean-to storage shed on the north wall, unprotected by glass or buffer, exposed to the full force of the northwest wind, read 10 degrees below zero inside. A bucket of water Alida had left there in the morning was frozen solid by midnight, frozen so hard that the wooden staves cracked and the ice expanded over the rim in a dome. Inside the glass walk, the same size bucket, set on the straw floor near the cabin wall, had only a skim of ice on the surface. Alida broke it with her knuckle, and the water beneath was still liquid. 2 buckets. Same water. Same night. One frozen to the staves, one barely skinned. The distance between them was 20 feet and a wall of salvaged glass and still air, and the body heat of 23 hens and 14 creek stones that had spent the last clear day drinking sun. The 45-degree difference was not a number Alida calculated that night. It was a number she would learn later when she compared the readings. But the proof was physical, immediate, and impossible to argue with. The north shed was a coffin. The glass walk was shelter. And the only difference was the structure Amos Dreckel had called a palace for chickens. Across the prairie, the blizzard was killing. Kersey's hired man, Levi Bost, tried to reach an exposed claim shanty half a mile from Kersey's place. He made it 200 yards before the wind knocked him down, and he crawled the rest of the way on his hands and knees, arriving with frostbite on both ears and 3 fingers on his left hand that would turn black by morning. A neighbor's cow froze standing up in a board shed with walls so thin the wind came through the gaps like water through a sieve. The cow was found the next morning, upright, ice in its nostrils, dead with its eyes open. Dreckel's delivery wagon was found abandoned on the Redfield Road, the horse still in the traces, alive but half crazed with cold and fear. Dreckel himself had made it back to the store on foot and spent the night burning broken crates in the storeroom stove. His coal delivery had not come. His own preparation had failed him in exactly the way he had predicted Alida's would fail her. Morning came blue and still. The wind stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the silence was so total that Alida could hear the blood in her own ears. She opened the glass walk door and stepped outside, and the cold hit her like a slap. It was still well below zero, but the air was calm, and the sky was the hard, bright blue that comes after a blizzard, the kind of blue that hurts to look at. The glass walk stood. Panes cracked, straw dusted with snow, the east corner patched with Warren Bell's shutters and oiled cloth, but standing. The hens were alive. Niels was alive, his fingers red and swollen, but moving. Cora was alive, her face blistered from the cold, her voice rough, her eyes holding something that had not been there before. The 2 buckets sat where Alida had placed them. The north bucket, a column of cloudy ice. The glass walk bucket, liquid water with a broken skim of ice floating on the surface. That was the argument. Not words, not calculations, not Kersey's math or Dreckel's mockery. 2 buckets, separated by 20 feet and a wall of glass, telling 2 different stories about what it meant to survive a night at 30 below. The blizzard had answered a question. What it had not done was settle the argument. Kersey came first. He rode up before noon on the day after the storm, frost still in his beard, his horse blowing clouds of vapor that the cold turned to crystals before they drifted afoot. He expected to find shattered glass. He had rehearsed the words he would say, something practical, something without cruelty, something that acknowledged a brave effort without endorsing a foolish one. He had buried enough stubborn homesteaders to know the tone. He stopped his horse at the fence line and looked at the glass walk. It stood, cracked and patched, and leaning slightly where the east corner had taken the worst of the wind, but standing. The south wall caught the morning sun and threw it into the airspace, and through the wavy panes he could see hens moving in the straw, alive, scratching, making the small sounds that living birds make when they are fed and sheltered and not frozen in their own feathers. Kersey dismounted. He walked to the glass walk door. He did not knock because it was not a house. He stepped inside. The warmth was not dramatic. It was not the blast of a heated room or the wave of a cook stove. It was a difference. A quiet physical difference between the air that burned his lungs outside and the air inside the glass space that did not. The straw was damp but not frozen. The stones along the cabin wall were cool to the touch but not cold. The hens ignored him. One pecked at his boot. He removed one glove and placed his hand flat against the cabin's south wall. The logs were warm, not hot, not summer, but warm in a way that a cabin wall exposed to a night of 30 below wind had no right to be warm. The heat was in the wood itself, slow, deep heat that had been absorbed from the sun-warmed airspace during the daylight hours, and held there by the mass of the logs and the stillness of the trapped air around them. Kersey held his hand there for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different than Alida had ever heard it. Not soft. Kersey did not do soft, but stripped of the certainty that had armored every word he had said to her since October. "I told you the winter would come through it," he said. "I was wrong. You made it stop outside." He did not apologize. He did not say he should have helped sooner. He was not that kind of man, and Alida did not need him to be. What he did was ask a question. Could a smaller version wrap a sod kitchen wall? Alida looked at him. The question was not hypothetical. Kersey had a sod kitchen behind his main cabin, a low structure where his wife baked and his hired man cooked. It faced south. Its walls were thick but cold. And Kersey, who had spent 40 years believing that heat came only from fuel, was standing in a glass walk full of hens and asking whether sunlight could keep his bread from freezing. "Yes," Alida said. "If the wall faces south and you leave space for air between the glass and the sod." "How much space?" 3 feet. "How do you keep the moisture out?" "Vents, high and low. 10 minutes morning and afternoon." Kersey nodded. He put his glove back on and walked to his horse and rode away. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. The question was the acknowledgement, and both of them knew it. Cora Bell came next, but her conversion had happened already, on the floor of the glass walk with a frozen shawl around her face and Alida's rope in her hands. What Cora brought now was not belief, but specification. She came with a knotted string marked at 3-foot intervals and a piece of charcoal and a list of questions written on the back of a feed sack. Where do the vents go? How far apart? How large? How steep does the roof need to be for snow to slide? Can sod work instead of logs for the inner wall? How many stones per foot of wall? What kind of straw? How often changed? Alida answered each one. She showed Cora the vent pegs, the putty technique, the diagonal bracing. She walked her through the glass walk and pointed to every failure, every cracked pane, every gap patched with cloth, every place where the design had been tested and had held, or had broken and been repaired. She did not present it as a perfect system. She presented it as a set of principles that could be adjusted, and Cora, who was practical enough to distrust perfection, trusted imperfection that came with honest measurements. Warren Bell came with his mother. He did not ask questions. He measured. He walked the 3-foot gap with boot-length paces. He counted the sash frames. He examined the corner post, the diagonal braces, the sill connections. He ran his finger along the putty lines the way Tolif had taught Alida, feeling for softness, for gaps, for the slight give that meant the seal was alive and not brittle. He did this quietly, with the focus of a man who was learning a trade he did not yet know he would practice. Other neighbors followed in ones and twos over the next 3 weeks. A family named Grindheim, 6 miles northwest, who had lost a sod dugout wall to frost heaving and wanted to know if glass could protect the replacement. A bachelor farmer named Peter Haugen, who had no livestock and no glass but wanted to understand the principle so he could apply it with whatever he had. A woman named Marte Flatten, whose husband was in Redfield working for the railroad and who was alone with 2 small children in a board shanty that the wind went through, like water through a net. Alida told them all the same thing. South face first, east face if you have enough glass. 3 feet of airspace, dark stones or dark painted barrels along the inner wall, vents high and low, straw kept dry. The sun does the work. The glass holds the work. The air carries the work to the wall stores it, and the vents keep the moisture from undoing everything. She shared freely. She charged nothing. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a nail, the same way she had drawn her own plans, and she let people copy them and ask questions and come back when the copies did not make sense. This was not generosity in the sentimental way that word is usually meant. It was practical. If her neighbors' cabins failed, the community weakened. If the community weakened, the services and trading that kept everyone alive through winter disappeared. Alida's survival was tied to the survival of everyone within trading distance, and making the method available was not charity, but investment. The measurable results accumulated. By the end of January, Alida had recorded 28 days where she burned half the wood Kersey had predicted for a cabin of her size. Her stove ran 6 hours a day instead of 20. She fed it 1 armload every 6 hours instead of every 4. By February, she had 1/2 quart of cottonwood left in the pile. Firewood that Kersey's math said should have been gone by Christmas. Her hens kept laying, not at summer rates, 3 or 4 eggs a day instead of a dozen, but steadily because the birds were dry, fed, and sheltered from wind that would have killed them or stopped production entirely. The eggs were currency. She traded them for oats at Gannett, for salt at Redfield, for a sack of cornmeal from a neighbor who had surplus. The glass walk was not just keeping her warm, it was keeping her economy alive. Drechel moved next, but not toward acceptance. He moved toward attack. His first claim was that Alida had stolen railroad property. The glass, he said, belonged to the railroad. Taking it was theft, and theft voided a homestead claim. He said this loudly, in the store, in front of 6 men who repeated it to their wives, who repeated it to their neighbors, who repeated it until the accusation reached Alida's ears 3 days after Drechel had spoken it. Alida walked to Gannett. She found Malin Voss on the platform, sweeping nothing, the way he always did. She asked for a copy of the receipt. Voss did not hesitate. He opened the depot ledger, found the entry, $3.24 eggs, dated October 1887, for salvage sash and frames from the decommissioned Gannett waiting room, and wrote a duplicate in his careful clerk's hand. He signed it. He stamped it with the depot seal. He gave it to Alida and said, "If Drechel wants to argue with a railroad receipt, he is welcome to take it up with the division office in Huron." Drechel did not take it up with the division office in Huron. His second attack was subtler. He told people the warmth in the glass walk came from animal filth, not sunlight. The hens, he said, were generating the heat. The glass was irrelevant. Alida had simply built an expensive chicken house and confused the stink of manure with the warmth of innovation. Tolif answered this one. He was sitting on the bench inside the glass walk when word of Drechel's claim reached the property, carried by Peter Haugen, who repeated it with the embarrassment of a man who does not believe what he is saying but feels obligated to report it. Tolif stood up. He coughed once, the deep, wet cough that had become his constant companion, and said, "Bring Drechel here. Tell him to stand in this glass walk at noon, then tell him to stand in the north shed. If he cannot feel the difference, his problem is not with the design. His problem is with his own hands." Drechel did not come. He did not need to. The challenge itself was the answer, and the fact that he refused it told the community everything they needed to know about which man understood the truth and which man feared it. Through February and into March, Tolliff and Alida refined the design. They added a removable canvas night curtain, a heavy piece of ticking fabric hung on pegs inside the glass walk, drawn across the glass at sundown to trap the day's heat against the cabin wall. The curtain was not glass, it did not stop wind, but it slowed the radiation of heat back through the panes, and on clear nights the cabin held 2 or 3 degrees warmer than it had without it. They replaced 4 of the cracked east panes with salvaged glass from a broken storm lantern and a fragment of window Cora found in her late husband's things. They painted 2 water pails black with stove blacking and filled them with water and set them on the south side of the glass walk, where the sun hit them directly. The pails absorbed heat all day and released it slowly through the night, adding a small but measurable warmth to the buffer space. They built a low chicken barrier from lath strips, creating a zone where the hens could roost and scratch without pushing manure against the cabin logs. The moisture problem that Tolliff had identified in December and that remained the design's most persistent threat. These were not revelations, they were refinements. The slow, patient work of making a crude system less crude, one adjustment at a time. Tolliff did not treat them as discoveries, he treated them as obligations. The design worked. Now it needed to work better, work longer, and work in the hands of people less careful than Alida. He began calling her Builder, not Mrs. Vangen, not Alida. Builder. The word carried weight coming from a man who had spent 30 years building structures that lives depended on. It was not sentiment, it was classification. He was placing her in a category of people who understood that making a thing right was different from making a thing, and that the difference mattered more than the thing itself. Tolliff worsened through March. The cough that had begun as a rasping in his chest settled into something deeper, something that bent him double and left him breathless for minutes at a time. He hid it from Niels. He could not hide it from Alida. The rags he coughed into were red more often than not, and he moved more slowly each day, resting between tasks that he had done without pausing in October. His final teaching came on a warm afternoon in late March. The sun was strong enough that the glass walk reached 70 degrees by noon, and the cabin wall was almost hot to the touch. 2 of the hens were panting. The straw smelled of fermentation. Alida wanted to leave the vents closed because visitors were coming, neighbors from north of Gannett who wanted to see the glass walk in operation, and she wanted the temperature high enough to be impressive. Tolliff made her open them. But the visitors will learn the wrong lesson if you show them a system that cooks its own walls. He removed 2 panes entirely. He set them against the cabin wall and let the March air move through the glass walk in slow currents, cooling the straw, drying the logs, calming the hens. The temperature dropped from 70 to 50. The visitors arrived to a glass walk that was warm but not dramatic. Tolliff showed them the vent system and the peg markings, sun, damp, and storm, and explained that the pegs mattered more than the glass. A thing that holds heat must also know how to let it go, he said. If you build this and you do not vent it, you will rot every log you meant to save. The vents are not a weakness in the design. They are the design. It was the last lesson he taught at the glass walk. He died in April in the rented room above the livery stable in Redfield. He died alone, which was how he had lived, but not how he had worked. He left 3 things for Alida: his brace square, his putty knife, and a railroad notebook filled with sketches of bridges and snow sheds and depot vestibules, and on the last 3 pages, the glass walk. Drawn from above, from the side, and from the inside looking out, with measurements in his careful hand. Alida did not cry when she heard. She walked to the livery stable and collected his things and brought them home and put the brace square on the shelf above the table and the putty knife in the toolbox and the notebook under her pillow. She cried that night, in the dark, with Niels asleep in the loft, and the hens settling in the glass walk, and the wind pressing softly against the panes. She cried because the cabin was warm, and the man who had helped make it warm was cold in the ground, and there was nothing she could build to fix that. The sun came in through the glass the next morning, the same way it always had. The stones warmed, the hens clucked, the The stove drew well. And Alida went to work, because work was the only language she knew for grief, and because Tolef would have been angry if she had done anything else. Spring passed. Summer. The glass walk stood open through the warm months, vents wide, panes propped up for airflow, hens wandering in and out. Alida repaired the putty where winter had cracked it. She replaced 2 sash frames with new ones cut from cottonwood and joined with Tolef's diagonal bracing. She taught Niels to warm the putty and set it in a bead, and he did it badly at first, and better each time, and by August his lines were clean enough that Alida said nothing, which was her highest praise. Cora Bell built a smaller glass porch over her dugout entry that summer. Alida helped. She showed Cora's boys how to set posts and run sill beams and brace the frames. She taught Warren to slope the roof steep enough to shed snow, 1 inch of drop for every foot of run, minimum, and to nail the sash at the bottom only, letting the top float on putty so the frame could breathe in the wind. She refused to let people nail glass rigidly into warped green lumber. This was the lesson that created the most arguments. Green lumber moved, it twisted, it shrank, it cupped and bowed as it dried. Nailing glass to green lumber was like nailing glass to a living thing. The wood would move, and the glass would break, and the person who built it would blame the glass when the fault was in the nailing. The glass does not fail, Alida told Cora's boys. The joint fails. Make the joint right, and the glass will last longer than the person who set it. She sounded like Tolef. She was aware of this. She did not mind. October of 1888 brought the secondary crisis. An ice storm hit early, weeks before Cora's glass porch was fully enclosed. The east side was open, the vents were not cut, and the sash frames were mounted without diagonal bracing because Warren had planned to add them the following week. The storm came at night. By morning, the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees, the unbraced frames on the east side were flexing in the wind, and condensation was running down the inner wall of Cora's dugout entry in streams that pooled on the dirt floor and turned to ice. Warren panicked. He wanted to close every opening, stuff rags in the vents, board up the unfinished east side, seal the whole structure against the wind. His instinct was the instinct of every builder who has never seen moisture destroy a wall. Stop the cold, keep the warm, shut everything tight. Alida arrived before noon. She looked at the condensation on the wall. She looked at the pooling water on the floor. She looked at Warren's face, which held the particular desperation of a young man who has promised his mother something he now believes he cannot deliver. Open the top vents, Alida said. They are not cut yet. There are no top vents. Then prop the 2 highest frames out from the sill, 2 inches. Use a stick. That will let the cold in. The cold is already in. The water is worse. She showed him. She propped 2 frames open on the highest rail, creating a gap barely wider than 2 fingers. Cold air entered at the top. Warm, wet air vented out. Within an hour, the condensation on the wall had stopped growing and begun to dry. The temperature in the porch dropped from 38 to 31, which was colder but survivable. The wall, which would have been ruined by 3 days of running water, began to dry. She stayed through the night. Cora's youngest, the same boy who had run through the blizzard without a coat in January, Stan, had croup. His breathing was harsh and wet, and in the cold air of the dugout it worsened until each breath sounded like a saw cutting green wood. Alida moved him into the glass porch, which was warmer than the dugout despite the propped frames, and hung a wet cloth near the vented opening where cold air entering met warm air leaving. The moisture from the cloth softened the air he breathed. By morning, the croup had eased. By the following day, the boy was eating. It was not the glass that saved him. It was the principle behind the glass, that trapped air could be managed, that warmth and moisture had to be balanced, that closing everything tight was not safety, but a different kind of danger. Alida had learned this from Tolef. Now she had applied it without him, in a structure she had not built, under conditions she had not anticipated. This was the moment the innovation left Alida's property and became a method, not because she had taught it, she had been teaching it for months, but because she had adapted it. She had taken a principle and applied it to a new problem in a new place, and it had worked not because the glass walk was magic, but because the thinking behind it was sound. If this story reminds you why preparation matters more than luck, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what Alita is building now is bigger than one cabin. Drekel saw the method spreading, and he did what Drekel always did. He found a way to profit from it. In November of 1888, he began importing cheap, thin glass panes from a wholesaler in Sioux Falls. He bundled them with scrap lumber and a sheet of printed instructions he had written himself, or hired someone to write, and sold them as storm glass kits for $3.50 each. The kits contained no diagonal braces. The lumber was green and warped. The instructions said nothing about putty warming, vent spacing, or the 3-foot air gap. They said to nail the glass to the wall as close as possible to the logs. He sold 11 kits in 3 weeks. The first failure came on a Thursday in early December. A family named Solheim, 8 miles west of Redfield, had nailed a kit to the south wall of their cabin following Drekel's instructions. Flush against the logs. No air gap, no vents. Green lumber frames nailed rigidly to green cabin walls. When the temperature dropped to 14 degrees and the wind picked up from the northwest, the lumber twisted, the frames flexed, and 7 of the 9 panes cracked and fell. The glass shattered on the frozen ground in front of the cabin. The family, who had spent $3.50 they could not afford, had nothing to show for it but nail holes in their cabin wall and a pile of broken glass that cut one of their children's bare feet. Drekel blamed Alita's design. He said the concept was flawed. He said glass was not meant for prairie winters. He said anyone who built something similar was risking their family. He said this in his store, to the same men who sat by the same stove, and the phrase he used was, "Vangan glass does not hold." Alita heard about it the next day. She did not go to Drekel's store. She went to the Solheim cabin. She looked at the nail holes. She looked at the broken glass on the ground. She looked at the scrap lumber that Drekel had bundled into the kit, green pine that had already twisted a 1/4 inch in the 2 weeks since it was nailed up. She picked up a piece of the lumber and held it beside one of Tollef's diagonal braces, which she had brought in her coat pocket. She showed the Solheims the difference. The brace was seasoned cottonwood, cut at 45 degrees, toe-nailed with 2 nails. The kit lumber was green pine, cut square, nailed with 4 nails driven so hard they had split the grain. "This is not my design," Alita said. "My design has bracing. My design has an air gap. My design has vents. This has none of those things. This is lumber nailed to a wall with glass in front of it. It was never going to hold." She said it quietly. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The Solheims could see the difference in their hands. Word traveled. It always did on the prairie. Within a week, 3 other families who had bought Drekel's kits came to Alita's claim to compare. She showed them the glass walk. She showed them the bracing. She showed them the vents, the putty, the 3-foot gap, the stones. She showed them everything Tollef had taught her, and everything she had learned since, and she did it in the glass walk itself, where the evidence was the temperature of the air and the warmth of the wall and the hens alive in the straw. Kersey came to the Solheim cabin on road business and saw the damage. He came to Alita's claim the same afternoon. He stood in the glass walk and said, "Drekel sold them lumber and called it a plan." Yes. His kits will kill someone. If the glass falls inward during a storm, yes. A child sleeping near the wall could be cut. Kersey rode to Redfield that afternoon. What he said to Drekel, Alita did not hear directly, but Drekel stopped selling the kits. He did not apologize. He did not admit fault. He simply removed the bundled lumber and glass from the store counter and replaced it with a sign that read, "Storm glass, inquire within," which meant he would sell the glass but not the plan, which meant anyone who wanted the method would have to get it from Alita. This was not a victory. It was a truce enforced by embarrassment and the threat of a dead child. Drekel had not changed. He had been contained. The difference mattered because it meant the threat would return, and Alita knew it, and she added Drekel to the list of things she had to watch through the winter, the way she watched the vents and the putty and the straw. The method spread anyway. By the end of 1888, 3 neighboring cabins had glass buffers in various stages of completion. Cora's dugout porch was finished and working. A sod house 4 miles north had a small glass vestibule over its south door, and Alita's glass walk, repaired and refined through 2 seasons, stood as the reference Zaro, the structure people came to measure before they built their own. She was no longer the woman Drekel had mocked. She was the builder Tolef had named, and the community that had laughed at her glass was now walking through it with knotted strings and charcoal marks, measuring the distance between survival and failure in the exact dimension Alita had calculated from the beginning. 3 feet of still air, held in place by salvaged glass, and the stubbornness of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Winter of 1889 arrived early, as if the prairie had decided that one killing season was not enough to settle the question. By November, the ground was frozen a foot deep, and the wind carried the particular dry bite that veterans of the northern plains recognized as the opening act of something worse. Alita's glass walk entered its second winter stronger than its first. She had replaced every cracked pane during the summer. She had reputtied every frame with linseed oil she had bought from Gannett with egg money. The diagonal braces which had held through the blizzard of January were reinforced with iron straps salvaged from a broken barrel hoop. Tolef's notebook had sketched the idea, but he had not lived to execute it. The straw was fresh. The stones were cleaned and repositioned. The vent pegs were marked and oiled. The canvas night curtain hung on new pegs, heavy enough to block radiant heat loss, light enough to roll in 30 seconds. She had also added something Tolef had not designed. Along the base of the south glass wall, on the inside of the glass walk, she placed a row of 6 black-painted water pails. Each pail held 3 gallons. Each pail sat in full sun from 9 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. And each pail, by late afternoon, held water that was warm enough to wash a face or soften dried beans or take the edge off a cold morning in a way that no creek water in November could. The pails were not a breakthrough. They were arithmetic. Water holds heat longer than air. Dark surfaces absorb more sun than light surfaces. A gallon of water warmed to 60 degrees in the afternoon will still be 45 degrees at dawn. 6 pails of 45-degree water in a glass walk at 20 degrees is the difference between comfort and endurance. Alita did not explain it in these terms. She did not need to. The pails were warm. The mornings were better. The explanation was in the touching. 3 families built glass buffers that autumn, working from plans Alita drew on pieces of brown paper with the nails she still used instead of a pencil. The Greinheims, 6 miles northwest, enclosed a 14-foot south wall on their rebuilt sod house. Peter Haugen, the bachelor farmer, built a 4-foot glass vestibule over his cabin door using 8 panes he had bought from Drekel at full price before the kits were pulled. And Marte Flatten, alone with 2 children in the board shanty, built a 10-foot glass lean-to with help from Warren Bell and lumber donated by Kersey, who said it was scrap from roadwork and who was not asked to prove it. Alita supervised each build. She walked each site before the first post was set and checked the compass heading with a stick and the noon sun, the same method she taught everyone saw her. Drive a stake, mark where its shadow falls at midday, and build your glass wall perpendicular to that line. South-facing within a few degrees of true south. Not east-facing, not southwest, not whatever direction the cabin happened to point. The sun did not compromise. The builder could not either. She checked each diagonal brace by pushing it with her hip, the way Tolef had shown her. She tested each putty line by pressing it with her thumbnail. She refused to approve any structure where the glass was nailed directly to the frame without a whisper of space for expansion. She was not gentle about it. She was not diplomatic. She pulled nails out of frames that had been set wrong and made the builder redo them while she watched. "You can be angry with me now," she told Peter Haugen, who had driven 4 nails too tight and cracked a pane in the process. "Or you can be angry with the wind later. The wind does not come back to fix what it breaks." She sounded like Tolef. She knew this. She carried his brace square in her coat pocket the way some people carry a watch. Not because she needed it every minute, but because holding it reminded her of the standard. The teaching scenes drew attention Alita did not seek. On a Saturday in late November, 3 families from north of Gannett came to her claim at the same time, each wanting to mark their south walls before the ground froze too hard for post holes. Alida stood in the glass walk with the noon sun falling through the panes and the hens scratching in the straw, and showed them how to drive a stake and read a shadow and measure 3 feet from a wall. She showed them the vent pegs. She showed them the stones. She showed them the night curtain. She answered their questions with the patience of someone who's been asked the same question many times and understands that each person asking it is asking it for the first time. Niels helped. He was 8 now, taller, still thin, still quiet, but capable in ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with repetition. He could warm putty and set a bead faster than most adults. He could test a brace by feel. He could tell by the sound of a pane in the wind whether it was seated correctly or walking loose in the rabbit. He did not talk much during the teaching sessions. He demonstrated. Alida would explain, and Niels would show, and the people watching would trust the boy's hands more than the woman's words, because a child who could do it meant the skill was learnable. Drekel watched the method spread from behind his counter. Each family that built a glass buffer was a family that did not freeze, did not relinquish, did not sell livestock at distress prices, did not come to him broken and begging. Each successful build cost him money he had counted on earning from failure. He did not say this. He did not need to. Alida could read the arithmetic in his prices. Nails went up by a penny a pound, putty by 3 cents a tin, glass panes by a dime each. Small increases, barely noticeable to a single buyer, but compounded across every builder in the district, they added up to a tax on the innovation that Drekel could not stop but could make more expensive. Alida said nothing about the price increases. She told builders to buy in pairs, splitting the cost of a keg of nails or a bulk tin of putty. She told them to salvage glass wherever they could, from abandoned claim shacks, from broken freight crates, from the railroad decommissions that happened every time a siding was closed or a depot was moved. Glass was everywhere on the prairie if you knew where to look, and Alida knew where to look because she had learned to see the world in terms of what could be trapped and held rather than what could be burned and lost. The crisis that broke Drekel came not from Alida, but from his own coal supply. In late December of 1889, the coal delivery that Drekel depended on for his store's heating failed. The supply train from Pierre was delayed by ice on the tracks, then rerouted through Huron, then delayed again by a derailment near Woolsey. The delay stretched from 3 days to a week to 12 days. And on the 4th night without coal, the temperature in Redfield dropped to 22 below zero, and Drekel's storeroom froze. The damage was specific and costly. 18 jars of preserved fruit burst when the liquid inside expanded into ice. 4 tins of lamp oil cracked at the seams and leaked across the floor, soaking into the floorboards in a stain that would smell of kerosene for years. A barrel of molasses froze into a block so hard that when it thawed in spring, the staves had split, and the molasses ran onto a shelf of dry goods worth more than Alida's entire claim. Drekel came to the claim at dusk on a January evening. He came alone, on foot, without his usual coat, the good wool coat he wore in the store to remind customers that he was a man of substance. He wore a canvas jacket and a hat pulled low, and he walked with the particular stiffness of a man who has been cold for long enough that his body has forgotten how to move freely. He did not come to the front door. He came to the glass walk. He stood outside the panes and looked in. The hens were roosting. The stones were dark with absorbed heat. The canvas night curtain was drawn. Through the glass, the air inside shimmered slightly with warmth, the way air shimmers above a road in summer. Drekel stood in the cold and looked at warmth he could not reach, and his face held an expression Alida had never seen on him before. Not humility. Drekel did not do humility any more than Kersey did softness. It was calculation. The look of a man running numbers he did not like and arriving at a total he could not argue with. Alida opened the glass walk door. "Mr. Drekel." "Mrs. Vangen." A silence. The hens shifted on their roosts. A pane rattled in a light gust and settled. "What would it cost," Drekel said, "to put a glass buffer over the store's south loading wall?" Alida did not answer immediately. She let the question sit in the air between them the way he had let the nail keg sit on the counter between them in October of 1887. She let him feel the weight of asking. "I do not want your money," she said. Dreckel's face tightened. Money was the language he understood, and a refusal of money meant the negotiation was happening on terms he did not control. "What do you want?" "Nails at cost, putty at cost, to any claimant who brings a signed plan from me, for as long as you keep the store." "That is not a price. That's a subsidy." "It is the builder's terms." Builder. He said the word the way he might say doctor about someone who had not attended school, with just enough skepticism to remind everyone present that titles could be questioned. Kersey's voice came from behind him. Alida had not seen him arrive. He was on horseback, visible only as a shape against the last gray light, but his voice was unmistakable, flat, certain, and utterly without patience for negotiation. "You asked the builder," Kersey said. "Take the builder's terms." Dreckel looked at Kersey. He looked at Alida. He looked at the glass walk, which was doing the thing he had said was impossible, in the place he had said would be a coffin, for the woman he had said was building a palace for chickens. "I will need the plan by Saturday," he said. He did not apologize. He did not say he had been wrong. He agreed to the terms and walked back to Redfield in the dark, and that was the end of the hostile skeptic. Not with a conversion, but with a transaction, which was truer to Dreckel's nature than any change of heart could have been. He had not become a believer. He had become a customer. And on the prairie, where survival ran on trade, a customer who supplied materials at cost was worth more than a convert who supplied nothing but admiration. Alida built the buffer on Dreckel's south wall the following week. She brought Warren Bell to help with the heavy lifting and Niels to hold the braces, and she worked in Dreckel's loading yard for 3 days, while Dreckel watched from inside the store and said nothing. When it was done, the loading wall was enclosed in a 6-foot glass buffer with 4 sash frames, diagonal bracing, 2 vents, and a row of dark-painted water pails along the base. The first sunny day after completion, the loading room temperature climbed from 12 degrees to 39 without a pound of coal. Dreckel stood in the loading room and held his hand against the wall and felt the warmth and said, "It is adequate." Alida packed her tools and left. Adequate was the best word Dreckel had, and she knew it. Warren Bell had been present through all of this, the building, the teaching, the confrontations, the slow transformation of the community from mockery to measurement. He had been present the way a fence post is present, upright, steady, load-bearing, and so consistently there that you stopped noticing until you leaned on it and found it solid. He had hauled sash from Gannett on his mother's wagon when Alida's hand sled broke in November. He had dug post holes when the ground was frozen and Alida's hands were too cracked to hold the shovel. He had measured walls and cut braces and held frames while she nailed, and he had done all of it without asking for credit or payment or explanation. He simply appeared in the morning, worked until the work was done, and went home. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened the way everything on the prairie happened, through labor. Warren did not bring flowers. He brought lumber. He did not write letters. He repaired the east corner post after a spring storm loosened the footing. He did not speak about his feelings. He walked Niels to the school in Gannett during the storms of 1889 and walked him home again 4 miles each way, without being asked and without mentioning it to Alida unless she mentioned it first. Alida noticed. She was not unaware. She was occupied. There is a difference between a woman who does not see a man and a woman who sees him clearly and is waiting to see if what she sees will hold. Alida had married once on the strength of words and promises, and the words had evaporated, and the promises had ridden away on a stolen horse. She was not going to do it again on anything less than evidence. The evidence accumulated. Warren fixed the glass walk door when the leather hinge tore in a wind. He built a proper chicken barrier from milled lath when the scrap lumber version collapsed. He arrived on the morning after a bad storm and checked every pane before Alida was awake, and when she came out to find him on a ladder with a putty knife, he said only, "The northeast corner had a whistle. I stopped it." The proposal came in the spring of 1890. and it was not a proposal in the way the word is usually understood. There was no bended knee, no rehearsed speech, no display of sentiment that would have embarrassed both of them. They were sitting in the glass walk on a warm April evening, watching the sun go down through the panes, when Warren said, "I am going to file on the quarter section east of here." Alida said, "Good land. Fair land, but it faces right." "Faces right for what?" "For a cabin with its best wall toward your morning sun." Alida looked at him. Warren looked at the sunset through the wavy glass. A hen settled on his boot, and he did not move it. "Would you object," he said, "if I built it that way?" She laughed. It was the first time in the entire span of this story, from the day Thomas left to this moment in the glass walk, that Alida Vangen laughed without immediately returning to work. The sound was strange in the glass space, bouncing off the panes and the stones and the cabin wall, and the hens looked up startled because they had never heard it before. "I would not object," she said. They married in 1891 in Redfield, with Kersey as witness and Cora Bell holding a bouquet of prairie grass because there were no flowers in March. Niels stood beside Alida in the coat that finally fit him, and he held the ring, a plain band Warren had bought in Huron with money he earned hauling freight for the railroad, the same railroad whose abandoned glass had started everything. The years that followed compressed the way years do when the crisis is past and the daily work of living replaces the daily work of surviving. Warren built his cabin on the adjacent quarter section, and its south wall faced within 5 degrees of true south, and the glass buffer was the first thing he constructed, before the floor, before the loft, before the door was hung. Alida helped him brace it. Niels, 9 years old now, set the putty. They did not combine the claims. Alida proved up her quarter section in 1892, 5 years after Thomas had filed and 3 years after she had begun living on it alone. The proof was submitted at the Redfield Land Office, with Kersey and Cora Bell as witnesses, and the clerk who processed it noted in the margin that the improvements included a glass-enclosed south and east buffer, the first such notation in the county's homestead records, though it would not be the last. By 1892, 4 neighboring cabins had glass buffers. 2 dugouts had sun porches. The Redfield School had a glazed entry vestibule for storm days, a 6-foot glass enclosure over the south door that kept the snow out and the warmth in during the 20-second walk from the building to the privy. The school board had not wanted to pay for it. Kersey had persuaded them by standing in the vestibule on a January morning and inviting the board chairman to stand outside it at the same time. The chairman lasted 4 minutes before he came inside and approved the expenditure. Alida never became famous. Her method was not written up in agricultural journals or presented at territorial fairs or adopted by the land office as recommended practice. It remained local, practical, and passed hand to hand, a set of principles carried in pencil sketches on brown paper and demonstrated in glass walks that people could step into and feel. The innovation traveled the way most useful knowledge traveled on the prairie, from one person who had done it to another person who needed to. Niels grew taller than the doorframe by 1893. He was 13, lean and quiet, with hands that could set putty and cut braces and test a pane by sound, a tap with the knuckle that told him whether the glass was seated or loose, a skill Tolliff had taught Alida and Alida had taught him. He did not remember a time before the glass walk. It was as natural to him as the stove or the well or the prairie itself, a part of the world that had always been there, though it had not. Alida kept a flock of 50 hens by 1895. The glass walk had been expanded twice, once to extend the east wall to the full length of the cabin, once to add a low glass cold frame along the south side for starting seedlings in March. The cold frame was not part of the original survival design. It was a consequence of it. The same principles applied at a smaller scale for a different purpose. Trapped air, dark soil, glass above, vents for moisture. The seedlings grew 3 weeks earlier than any in the district, and Alida sold transplants at Gannett for a penny each, which was not much money and was not the point. She became the person new claimants visited before their first winter. They came to the glass walk the way patients come to a doctor, with specific symptoms, and a hope that someone who had seen worse could tell them what to do. Alida listened. She measured their south walls with her eyes. She asked about their timber, their glass supply, their skill with tools. She drew plans on brown paper and marked the vent positions and the brace angles and the putty technique. She lent her brace square to people she trusted to return it, and she did not lend it to people she did not. She never told anyone it was easy. She never said the glass walk would save them. She said it would help if they built it right, and she said that building it right meant venting it even when the warm air felt too precious to waste, and bracing it even when the braces seemed like extra work, and checking the putty even when the putty looked fine. She said these things because Tolef had said them to her, and because the distance between a glass walk that worked and a glass walk that collapsed was not materials or money, but attention. The original salvaged glass from Gannett lasted 7 years. By 1894, the panes had been replaced one at a time as they cracked or clouded or were broken by hail. The sash frames, reinforced with iron strap and reputtied each autumn, lasted longer. Some of them were still in service when Alida died. The structure itself was repaired, modified, and rebuilt in sections over the decades, the way any working building is maintained by the people who depend on it. It was never finished in the way that a showpiece is finished. It was always in progress, always being adjusted, always reflecting the current state of knowledge and the current condition of the weather. Alida Vangen died in the winter of 1917 after a pneumonia that had settled in her lungs in December and refused to leave. She was 62. She died in the same cabin she had been told to abandon, in the same room where Kersey had said the frost was inside the logs, in the same bed where she had sat and counted her resources and found them impossibly short and decided to bet everything on glass and sunlight and still air. The glass walk stood outside the south wall. It had been rebuilt twice. The panes were not the originals. The frames were not the originals. The stones had been replaced, the straw changed 1,000 times, the vents recut and rehung. But the principle was the same. 3 feet of air, south-facing glass, dark mass against the wall, vents high and low. The sun does the work. The glass holds the work. The builder watches. Warren survived her by 6 years. Niels, who had become a carpenter, the profession Tolef had practiced and Alida had learned, built glass buffers on 11 properties in Spink County between 1900 and 1920. He used Tolef's brace square until the brass fittings wore smooth, and then he used it some more. He never called what he built a glass walk. He called it a buffer. The word was Alida's, borrowed from Tolef, borrowed from the railroad snow sheds that broke the wind before it could reach the tracks. By the time the railroad painted over the old Gannett siding sign, Alida's Palace for Chickens was no longer a joke. It was a thing people measured before winter, 3 feet of gap, a south wall, vents high enough to bleed damp air, dark stones where the low sun could reach. The method had no name because it did not need one. It was knowledge carried in hands and habit, passed along like a recipe or a prayer, not because someone wrote it down, but because someone showed someone else, and that person showed another, and the chain did not break. Alida lived out her life on the same quarter section she was told to abandon. The hens changed. The glass changed. The boy grew taller than the doorframe, then taller than the cabin, then tall enough to lift sash frames that she could no longer carry. But the winter habit remained. Each autumn, before the first hard freeze, Alida walked the glass walk and pressed each pane with 2 fingers, listening for rattle. A pane that rattled was a pane that would fail. She fixed it that day. She fixed it every day it needed fixing, for 30 years, because Tolef had told her that rattle meant the point had walked, and a point that walked let the pane walk, and a pane that walked fell. Amos Dreckel had called it a palace for chickens and a coffin for herself. He said it in October, when the glass was stacked and the logs were leaking, and the math said Alida Vangen would be dead by Christmas. On the coldest remembered night, January 12, 1888, 30 degrees below zero, the wind strong enough to kill a man in a quarter mile, that palace held enough warmth to soften a frozen mitten. That coffin became a classroom where neighbors learned to trap the sun. The glass that Dreckel said would shatter held through a blizzard that stopped clocks and froze cattle standing in their sheds. The last image is not a number or a principle or a speech about the human spirit. It is a morning, dawn after the blizzard, the sky so blue it hurts, the prairie still 30 below and silent, and behind the wavy, mismatched, bubbled panes of a glass walk built from salvaged railroad windows, hens move in gold light, scratching in warm straw, alive because a woman understood that winter sun is not warmth until it is trapped. Alita's hand rests flat against the cabin log, warm, solid, holding, while outside the cold stretches to the horizon and stops 3 feet short. The winter had come for the cabin, but Alita Vangen had made it stop 3 feet short,